Hi.
Thank you very much.
First of all, yeah, I know. I also apologize for the technical issues. I have to say that in some ways I feel like I'm embodying the spirit of COVID and 2021 by the hybrid mode, in the sense that I'm delivering this online in the morning, and then in the afternoon I'll be joining you for the workshop on journal editors. So I feel as if I'm doing both. I'm on the one hand um, delivering on Teams, and then coming in person. But anyhow, thank you very much, Jifu, for that excellent introduction, and I very much appreciate Professor Wei's remarks as well. What I would like to do today is, for the first 5 minutes or so, reflect a bit on what I said 6 months ago, and then how that relates to the topic I'm going to talk about today, which is the importance of nuclear energy as part of the energy mix if we're going to ensure just and sustainable energy transitions. So to begin, I'd like to go back and reflect on what I said in June of 2021, because I think much of it is still true, that the challenges around climate change globally are very similar to the challenges around COVID-19, that in a sense, COVID-19 has provided a bit of a dress rehearsal for some of the issues around global governance, particularly around equity and justice, because just as there are real problems getting vaccines into arms in the global south, there is also the very real and immediate fact that climate change is already affecting the global south much more severely than other parts of the world, both the developed north and middle income countries as well. We also have seen that the scale of investment necessary to meaningfully challenge the inequalities and the economic damage caused by COVID-19 is very similar to the sort of response that will be necessary at a much larger scale with respect to climate change. So I think, in a sense, that IPCC report in 2018 was a bit prescient when they said increasing investment in physical and social infrastructure is a key enabling condition to enhance the resilience and adaptive capacities of societies. And I think that is still very much true. But the challenge now is how to do that in a just way, and how to attack head on some of the very real paradoxes at the heart of sustainable development. And here I also want to remind people that I see this as a three-player game between the market, the state, and financial capital, with a nod to Bill Janeway. I don't think that this is a question in the policy space of should we leave it to the market or should the state intervene. Clearly, in some instances, there is a role for the market. In other instances, there's the role, for significant state intervention. But the reality is that in a globalized economy, financial capital plays a very significant role in financing solutions, whatever the sources of funding, whether it's funding from the market or funding from the state. Financial capital arranges the finance and structures the finance. And I think one of the real problems right now, and why we've gotten to a bit of an impasse, and why they're not the infrastructure projects that financial capital is willing to invest in, is because there is something fundamentally disingenuous about sustainable development, in inverted commas, because to have meaningful development, you have to have large-scale carbon emissions, that building cities, building transport, relocating cities, building meaningful flood defenses are very carbon intensive. They're not particularly green-friendly projects for investors in the north to invest in. And the problem is that there is not the deal flow in sustainable development that is necessary to affect the scale of change. So we need to step back and stop deceiving ourselves about the realities, and to think a bit more generally about what's really going on here. I also want to reiterate what I said 6 months ago, and that is I think we are well past the window where bottom-up behavioral change can meaningfully affect climate change globally. That these things are obviously important, but the idea of reducing air travel, phasing out personal cars, and protesting deforestation is all very valid in terms of maintaining the political will in the North to mitigate, but it's not going to fundamentally shift the larger global picture on climate change. And I think that that's a reality we have to accept. And I think also the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that the appetite in the North for meaningful behavioral change is very limited, that you could impose initial lockdowns and get most people to obey. But 2 years on, it's very difficult to get people to wear masks on the tube, let alone turn off the lights and behave in ways that would meaningfully address climate change. So I think that COVID-19 really has shifted the political calculus on climate. And I did say this 6 months ago, and I still stand by this. I think that it's shown us that demand side reductions do not work for their own scientific, political, economic, and social reasons. And again, the scale of COVID denial, the scale of vaccine refusal in the West has shown us that there is not the political will to affect behavioral change. Mitigation will have to focus on the supply side with significant sectorial interdependencies. And here, of course, energy is key, because if you can change the energy mix, then you can also more realistically decarbonize transport, and you can begin to decarbonize manufacturing in ways that are politically and economically realistic. Also, it's become very, very clear that the speed of climate change has accelerated the timetable for adaptation, that we know that in the global South, adaptation is a reality in day-to-day life. The effects of climate change are being felt on the ground. They are very significant, and prime ministers from the Marshall Islands and should not have to stand in waders in water to reassure the global community that this is something that it's affecting them on decadal timescales. But it is a reality, and it's a reality on the ground. And here, climate justice is the key concern, because the problem is that the global South needs to develop not only to adapt to climate change, but also to alleviate extreme poverty. And to do that means to, on the one hand, emit quite a lot of carbon, and on the other hand, in many cases, to retain energy sources that are fairly carbon intensive. So that question of how we achieve climate justice while also fighting climate change is very difficult indeed. And I think it's also clear from the last COP that remediation is becoming more important, and especially the negative emissions technologies around steel, concrete, and energy, but also eventually climate repair strategies, particularly around ocean acidification, which is as my colleague Raymond, who's here, knows, is very dangerous globally to everyone. So, one of the things that has happened in the last couple of years with the collaboration with BIT is that we have done quite a lot of work on the social costs of carbon in the developing world, led by Yang Pu, who's a PhD student who's in the audience. She was trained at BIT and then has joined UCL and as a PhD student who works with Jifu and me. And she has shown very decisively that the average social cost of carbon in developing countries is 20 times higher than in developed countries. This article in the Journal of Cleaner Production is the culmination of that work. And it is very much the case that climate justice is an issue for us now. It's not something that we need to think about 20 or 30 years later. We need to think about it now. It is the biggest issue, and we saw this in COP26, and this is why COP26 didn't achieve the kinds of agreements that the people were hoping for. Developing countries cannot achieve elimination of extreme poverty without continued use of fossil fuels, and developed countries are responsible for historical emissions. We know this, but it's very difficult politically to make that understanding stick in terms of the political will to mitigate in the North. Also, climate change adaptation, meanwhile, entails really significant carbon emissions, and we can't get around that. And it's something that generally is not politically very palatable to say, but it's true. Infrastructure, which is the key to adapting to climate change, by some calculations accounts for almost 70% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, certainly carbon emissions anyway. Methane is a somewhat different story. Construction accounts for 30 to 40%, depending on the accounting strategy, with Portland cement the single biggest source for the industry, although steel is also a problem, but perhaps more easily addressed by negative emissions technologies. So climate justice is the biggest issue, and it's here. And the question is, how do we ensure climate justice? How do we find growth-sparing pathways so that we're not sacrificing the lives of those in the global South? And again, I spoke before about this trilemma, about how we can pursue mitigation, adaptation, and remediation at scale. And certainly right now, what we have to think most about is this trade-off between mitigation and adaptation, and how do we ensure that the global South can adapt to climate change within the timescales necessary. Which brings me to today's intervention, and that is that I think it is really significant that in August of 2021, 2 months before the COP formally kicked off, the UNECE, which is to say, Europe, the part of the UN that speaks for Europe and speaks about Europe, conceded really for the first time that international climate objectives will not be met if nuclear power is excluded. And I think this is really critical because actually it is the Western left that is the most significant opponent of nuclear power, because people who are in the Green Party remember protesting nuclear armament, trying to affect nuclear disarmament, and as a consequence, they are themselves very reluctant to get behind nuclear power as a possible solution. And of course, also entrenched interests on the right, particularly the fossil fuel industry, has likewise been really quite happy to encourage opposition to nuclear power because it's good for their business strategy. But nuclear power is a low carbon energy source, and as the lead to this article, this press release concedes, it's avoided about 2 years worth of total global energy emissions in the last 50 years. So it's potentially a very significant source if it can be employed safely and with adequate global governance. And this is for the first time, Europe conceding that this is necessary, that this has to be part of the mix. So if we concede that there is now a window in which it's possible to talk about nuclear in a way that it hadn't been this time last year, I think it's important to tease apart what this actually means. So again, growing up as I did in Moab, Utah, this cartoon, which one of the PhD students found, is very familiar to me, because certainly in the 70s and 80s, growing up in the American West, in the area that was once controlled by the Atomic Energy Commission, it seemed pretty obvious to all of us the 21st century would be the nuclear century. And this kind of imagery, was very much part of the discourse, the idea that nuclear is clean and climate friendly. Whereas I think partly because of 3 Mile Island and then Chernobyl and then the disaster in Japan, there's a sense that nuclear is unsafe and it will lead to nuclear proliferation without any really significant attempts to understand whether the environmental damages and the lives lost to these nuclear accidents compare to the environmental damage and lives lost by the widespread use of fossil fuels. But the point is that right now, today, and again, this is work that our PhD students who are here today, Shenlu Sun or Sun Shenlu and Pu Yang or Pang Yu, have themselves been helpful in assembling some of this data. But around 10% of the world's electricity is generated by nuclear power. Yang Pu. I got a bit confused with the inversion of the Chinese names, and I want to apologize to her for that. But anyway, around 10% of the world's electricity is generated by nuclear power today. Clearly, the existing nuclear fleet, much of which was built quite a long time ago, is coming to the end of its life. That's also a problem because some of this fleet involves the heavy water reactors that have been the source of nuclear accidents in the past. Particularly the Chernobyl reactor, which even at the time that the accident occurred was nearing the end of its life. There is a significant gap to net zero and some planned construction, but again, there is a capacity gap, and what we can see globally is that there are some countries that have been very quick to embrace nuclear power, but the vast majority have tended to shy away from it. But I would like to argue somewhat controversially today, to get the conversation about this going, is that if the world is to succeed in a fight against climate change, it's vital that developing countries, including those in the African continent, adopt low carbon electricity systems so that they can keep pace with increased demand and population growth. And I think nuclear power is probably the only realistic strategy here. Otherwise, it's impossible to ensure climate justice, as we saw with India's stand at COP26. And we do have the Nordhausian integrated climate economy models that we can use to understand why we're making this argument. We can roll the dice in a sense. And to reiterate for those in the audience who are not close to the work on the integrated assessment models, these were developed by William Nordhaus, who won a Nobel Prize in 2018. It's one of the three main integrated assessment models used by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, but also it has been criticized for lowballing the scale of climate damage to the wider economy. So in a sense, it provides a lower bound estimate, which I think is helpful for these discussions because this is the lower bound, and models that are enriched will provide an even larger assessment of the potential impact here. So we look at three scenarios, and again, this is very much back of the envelope, but this is something that we intend to unpack in considerable detail and hopefully publish mid next year. But there are three scenarios. The one scenario, of course, is no nuclear. And that is the one that traditionally the global, the European left has been in favor of, and others, in the fossil fuel industry have as well, that there'll be a global phase out. No new reactors will be built after 2020. And of course, those reactors that are in use will be retired by 2040. That's one scenario. The conventional nuclear scenario is that the current technologies that are commercially available today will be used in the future, but advanced technologies will not be used. Fast breeder reactors will not enter the energy mix, and uranium extraction will only occur from proven geological reserves rather than from seawater, which will diminish eventually the resource base. And then there's the advanced nuclear scenario that suggests that there'll be no restrictions other than those that limit proliferation of weaponry, and that fast breeder reactors as well as light water reactors will be used, and that there'll be no restrictions on nuclear expansion or technology use. So these are the three scenarios that we look at. And in terms of the regional impact of nuclear phase out, what you can see in terms of potential effects on GDP and potential welfare effects. Again, this is very back of the envelope, but it's a starting point for the discussion. And then the effect that this will have on income per capita in the US. But the more important thing are these findings, and that is that expanding commercially available nuclear technologies results in 10% savings in the mitigation cost in our base results, and that these reach 20% when advanced nuclear technologies are used. And fast breeder reactors are actually preferred by those who've been negotiating for safe extension of nuclear power in the developing or in the global south, because fast breeder reactor technology is much harder to be used in ways that could enrich uranium for nuclear weapons. So it is actually a safer solution in any case. And then this question of alternative uranium extraction methods would potentially contribute as well. But the key thing is the use of fast breeder reactors. The damage nuclear deployment allows more emission reduction and avoids a certain amount of climate damage in the long run. The damage reduction is at the minimum 7%, with a confidence interval of about 1 to 20% by the end of the century if advanced technologies are available, and 3% for the conventional scenario. But the thing to bear in mind here is that this is the lower bound estimate based on the DICE models. So the economic benefits suggest that the social cost of carbon can be lowered by 0.6%, and netting economic output will increase by 0.1%, and the welfare increases are not insignificant either. So what I want to suggest today is that more research is needed. If you just use the DICE models, which look at economic sectors that are directly affected by climate change and not the wider economy as a whole, you still get significant results. And if you use more robust models that do look at nonlinear climate damage and look at the wider economy, then these estimates are likely to be very much higher. What we also recognize here is that this is not the only high growth pathway. Nuclear energy is one high growth pathway. There are other high growth pathways as well, but those are far less certain. That negative emissions technologies, whether it's at the sectorial level in terms of carbon capture and carbon storage, or whether it's the kind of direct air capture technology that you see, for example, the Iceland experiment with the Orca. The technological innovation necessary to make these scalable is much greater. The nuclear technology already exists, and it is possible to negotiate for the sorts of treaties that allow the safe use of this technology in parts of the developing world. The security issues, have widely been acknowledged and can be researched and discussed, but I think the issue here is that they're very rarely thought about in the round. That people can say that nuclear is a no-go because it is possible under some very limited circumstances to extract nuclear fuels that can be enriched and used at least for dirty bombs, if not for tactical nuclear weapons. But the reality is that it's also true that nuclear fuels are not the only source of radioactive material for dirty bombs. And in fact, hospitals in middle-income countries that were the recipient of aid money 50 years ago have radiographic equipment that is much more accessible for the types of fuels necessary to commit those kinds of acts of nuclear terrorism. And as far as enriching nuclear fuels go, the fast breeder reactor technology is safe and effective and prevents nuclear proliferation. But the key thing is that whether or not you think the risk of nuclear proliferation is high from the use of nuclear energy, what is rarely thought about in the round is the extent to which energy insecurity globally, particularly if you consider the effects that energy insecurity has on climate justice, is also potentially a trigger of conflict and potentially a trigger of nuclear conflict, entirely independently of nuclear power being part of the energy mix. So we have to take climate justice seriously. People like me would say you have to take climate justice seriously because it's the right thing to do, because it's unethical to sacrifice the poverty alleviation and the development goals of the global South in order to achieve mitigation targets set globally. But it's not just the right thing to do. It's absolutely necessary in order to avoid the kind of conflict that can become very dangerous to everyone globally. And I think a lot more work needs to be done on this, because I think that those who believe that nuclear is too dangerous to be allowed don't really think about the alternatives and how dangerous those scenarios are as well. Also, and at the risk of coming across as a bit of a doom goblin here, I want to say that, in fact, I do think that the COVID-19 pandemic has produced some really hopeful signs around global governance, particularly in terms of the World Health Organization potentially retooling itself to become much more active in pandemic surveillance. And I think it is possible at the same time to develop global governance frameworks around the use of nuclear technology globally that can allay some of the concerns that people have about the security of nuclear fuels. But I want to end by saying that really, in my view, nuclear energy does promote climate justice. There are risks involved, but it is a high growth pathway. It is a growth sparing solution that promotes climate justice. It makes it possible for the global South and for others to eliminate extreme poverty. It makes it possible for middle income countries to continue their development pathways, and that needs to be more widely emphasized. It can provide, and not just in the traverse as we get to net zero, but even beyond that traverse, a meaningful, enduring solution to decarbonizing the energy mix, at least until we get to technologies like nuclear fusion that are potentially even safer. But also, researchers can help change the debate, help to make the debate more realistic, to shift the debate away from the argument that solar PV and wind are the solution, given the embedded carbon and the difficulty in those technologies in terms of the operating expenditures of employing them at scale. Researchers can make the debate more realistic, and can also help to dismantle this idea that sustainable development is effortless to achieve, that there aren't paradoxes at the heart of it, because there are very real paradoxes at the heart of sustainable development. And taking climate change seriously means finding growth sparing pathways to combating climate change globally. And again, what I'm calling for here is really a sense of realism about what sustainable development means, as well as making the suggestion that actually it's really a good thing that nuclear is back on the table as part of a discussion about decarbonizing the energy mix, and that I was really very much reassured to see the UNECE, of all people, saying this has to happen. Nuclear energy has already saved us 2 years worth of global greenhouse gas emissions, or at least carbon emissions, and can potentially be even more valuable as we move on in affecting energy transitions to net zero. So I'll leave you there. Thank you for your patience. I realize that this is a somewhat controversial intervention, but I hope you find it helpful. And I share with Jifu and with Professor Wei a commitment to finding growth-sparing pathways to net zero, and that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Many thanks, Damaris. I totally agree with Damaris that nuclear is very important for us to mitigate climate change. If we cannot find other stable, low-cost, low-carbon energy. So okay, so we can have a time for one question. So if you yes please. Can you give the microphone, please? Yes, please.
I talk very loud so much, but you will be able to listen to me anyway.
Okay, so we need to let the people online to hear you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Gabriel Origioni. I work at Imperial College. My question is, in the presentation it says that the DICE model considering a scenario with non-nuclear. In the case of countries like China or India, in that scenario, what is assumed to be used in replacement of the nuclear capacity that they would have? And second, if I may, you say that the UNECE now is arguing for nuclear, but if you see the European scenario for the long-term strategy, the shares of nuclear was really very low in 2018, and the text in 2020 for the 2030 target is also very low. Okay, thank you very much. I'm very interested in the presentation.
Thank you. Okay, so to take the first question, the UNECE is making an intervention based on what's going on in Europe. They're saying that actually nuclear needs to be part of the discussion and the attitudes in Europe need to change. So I would absolutely agree with you that in general, in many countries, the antagonism to nuclear energy being part of the energy mix in Europe is persisting and is very slow to change. Although interestingly, the Traffic Light Coalition in Germany seems to be more amenable than its predecessors even, which is a bit ironic given the involvement of the Greens in that coalition. And look, I'm very pro-green in most respects. This is just one aspect of their policies I've never been particularly keen on, because I do think nuclear is important. In terms of the assumptions that we make, look, China is like other countries with nuclear power installed capacity now, it comes to the end of its useful life in most cases by 2040. So the assumptions that we're making essentially is that the nuclear power plants come out of commission by 2040, and that otherwise the energy mix remains the same. So it's replaced, as it is proportionately. Although it is true that it will be decarbonized, as in line with China's commitments, but we're not making any particular assumptions about what will replace nuclear, whether that will be entirely renewable, because it obviously can't be. And I suppose somebody might complain and say, well, actually, if China replaces all of its nuclear capacity with other stuff that is renewable, then your calculations need to change. But the reality is that can't happen in most cases, because it's not realistic, given the contribution of nuclear to the energy mix in China, to assume that it will all be replaced with solar PV and wind farms in Tibet. That's just not going to happen. So we assumed that it would, as that capacity came off stream, it would be replaced as it is proportionately today. So thank you for asking that question, and I hope that answers it.